Thanks, everybody. My name is Chris Crocket. I'm the Regional Aquatics Manager for the Division of Wildlife Resources out of our Springville office. So I oversee what we call the Central Region, so that's Utah Lake, Strawberry, Deer Creek, Jordanelle, Grantsville, Settlement, kind of everything in between. I also brought Mike Packer today. I'll let Mike introduce himself, but I'll say a few mostly kind words about Mike. Mike, I forget even what his title is, he can tell you, but he's really also our community fishing expert, and he and a couple of the other guys in the office are really our warm water experts. So we've got a pretty good mix of kind of our cold water, our trout guys, but also we've got people like Mike and I that slum it on Utah Lake fishing for white bass or catfish or dare we say carp. So Mike, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. Work with Chris Crocket out of our Central Region office. Like you mentioned, primarily over community fisheries. I am the wildlife recreation specialist, so a lot of the fishing reports and things like that come through me. Just get excited about warm water fisheries. Cool water and trout and things like that are great, but I have a special place in my heart for a lot of these warm waters. So when it comes to Utah Lake, it's right in my backyard, and love to go fishing. So it's a fun water to hit.
So when you guys look at the fishing report and it's like 4 months old, that's because Mike's doing about 7 other jobs along with the fish reports, right, Mike?
Yes. So jab me with a gentle stick.
Yeah.
All I heard was his fault that it doesn't get updated. That's all I heard.
And when you that's the takeaway. When you call and complain, he's going to assign you. He's going to go, all right, Badger.
Yeah.
I need a fishing report. I don't want to hear any complaints.
Well, I'm hoping we can contribute.
So, came to talk white bass today. I'll just tell you guys straight up. I'm at heart an angler, which means I know everything there is to know until I go and have a day I don't hardly catch anything, and then I'm looking at YouTube with you guys, and I'm surfing the web and trying to figure out what I did wrong. So I feel a little odd trying to talk to you guys about white bass because I have a feeling that probably half, if not 3/4 of you probably catch more white bass than I do. But I have put in my time, so I'll always kind of give you the basics. But one thing I do want to encourage, feel free to ask some questions. But really, I'm going to go through this pretty quick, and then I'm hoping to hear from you guys on what has worked for you, where you target white bass, if you're willing to tell us your tricks of the trade, just kind of have that little banter, if you will, back and forth. So I'll talk a little bit about everything on white bass. We'll talk about life history just pretty quick. Talk about the spawn and typical activity patterns, hotspots, which none of these are really secrets on Utah Lake, lures and tactics, and then maybe just some other resources.
Is this going to be like Badger? Do we have this captured on the video that you have on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And Mike's got it on PowerPoint too. I can share that with you guys and send it over to a PDF. And there's going to be some links in here, which obviously probably won't make sense up here, but they should be active in the PowerPoint, or if not, I can send you some.
I'll link a PDF to the YouTube video.
Cool. That's good. So just a very quick overview on the biology. So white bass is one of the Ranidae family, the temperate basses. So these are such things as, if you go to other parts of the country, we've got white bass, we have yellow bass, striped bass, and so these are kind of all look fairly close to what you typical expect for white bass or striped bass. Obviously, the family has some pretty broad different ranges. White bass are found predominantly in the Midwest and Southeast. I should say they're native to the Midwest and Southeast. If you grew up fishing for these in Tennessee, where I grew up, we called them stripes. Not striped bass, just like stripes. Here they're called white bass. I've heard them called silver bass. Anybody else call them anything different here? White bass, yeah. So like I say, back east, there's kind of about 3 or 4 different species that get lumped under that stripes listing. They were introduced to Utah Lake in 1967. So you think of Utah Lake, I typically think June sucker, channel cats, and white bass. But in reality, they haven't been around that long in Utah. There's really very few other spots in Utah that they're well established. have some that show up in the severe river drainage, Jordan River, obviously, but really when I think white bass in Utah, I think Utah Lake. And that is true when we do our population numbers. So there's quite a few different ways that we monitor fish in Utah Lake. So I might show you a couple of different scenarios, but pretty much no matter how we monitor fish in Utah Lake, white bass come up as first, second, or third most frequent. So you can imagine when we were doing a lot of common carp work, and 98% of the biomass was common carp, and that was about our number one fish we encountered. Typically, though, white bass is our number two fish that we encounter when we're doing any sort of monitoring. If you looked at it from biomass, it's probably pretty comparable. We got a lot of carp now, but we've seen a really good increase in white bass numbers through the years as well. So that brings up an interesting point. Most of these white bass that we catch in Utah Lake are really probably only about 2 to 3 years old. So this is a fairly fast-growing fish, but it maxes out, especially in Utah, really just at about that, if you catch a 12 to 14-inch white bass, you've done something well. The record in Utah is it 4 pounds? Either 4 pounds or 6 pounds, I forget, but that's pretty few and far between. Most of these fish that you're catching, when they're averaging that 9 to 11-inch stage, that could either be a 1-year-old fish or that could be a 3-year-old or maybe even a 4-year-old fish. Because white bass are definitely, can be a little bit stunted. You can have some density dependence issues. So, you go to Utah Lake State Park and you catch 800, you've got a lot of fish competing for those limited resources. So these can still be very healthy fish, right? But they're kind of getting to that age, or that size around 1 or 2 years old. They may not be getting much bigger. Average size, again, about 9 to 11 inches. Average weight is usually about a third to a half a pound. Perfect fish taco size, though. They fillet pretty easy, really. After about number 50, you might be rethinking your decisions. But it's still a great eating fish. Short-lived, fast-growing, no consumption advisories, anything like that. No limits. Don't waste the fish, but basically it's a great opportunity to come out and catch a lot. Just a little bit more, I'll just highlight a few of these key things. This is some of our work while we're out observing the carp removal. Just kind of highlight, when you look at the number of fish that we're catching through that methodology with big seines, it's pretty much always white bass. It's our number one fish. A little different, this is some of our fish community monitoring. There's a lot going on here, but really just kind of highlighting, this is the proportion of catch. So you can see in red, when we're doing that monitoring, we've got about 39% of those fish that we're catching are white bass. Common carp usually making up about 19%. So again, just really illustrating that these are pretty common in Utah Lake. Typically about the first or second most commonly encountered species. We've got some relative weights at the top there. So you see mean WR. Relative weight is just a length-weight relationship, and you can kind of think of it almost as like a percentile. Like if you've had kids, and they're like, your kid's like 90th percentile for weight. Well, when you see that number up there, 86, that means essentially these guys are 86th percentile for weight. Just to kind of point out, they're pretty healthy. You see, they're kind of around that mid-80s, upper 80s type of range. But you can definitely see through some years, they've had some lean years basically where there's a lot of fish, but they're not getting a lot to eat.
White bass, I'm on, in fact, somebody's got a boat wants to go out and fish them, catch them. I sold my boat to Roger last year. Big mistake. But anyway, it's a feeding frenzy when they're starting to spawn. You go absolutely crazy. Wherever you throw the line, you can pull them in. You just keep going till you get tired and put the rod down. So if you haven't fished for them, it's a real treat.
We were talking here that those are the years you remember, those are the trips, and those are the ones that we want to put in your head.
Oh my gosh, it's incredible. I did it in Wisconsin last year. My son-in-law, Fremont. just crazy. Wherever you throw a line, you walk out at any dock, throw a line in the water, in a minute, you got a white bass chewing on your minnow or whatever.
Now I notice he's not telling us stories about the 7 or 8 times he went out and didn't catch fish. But that does happen on Utah Lake. It's not a matter of not being able to catch the fish, if you will. It's a matter of finding them. And if you can find them, you can get into them no problem.
I know what the other question was. I'm old and I can't remember all of that. Everybody's telling me, you catch fish in Utah Lake, don't eat it. I know the bottom is full of muck and probably not good if somebody's eating that stuff. But I can't imagine being that polluted.
Yeah, there are fish consumption advisories for a few different species, channel cats being the one that comes to mind. I always encourage everybody to check out, if you just Google Utah Fish Advisories, it takes you to the health department's site and it tells you all those consumption advisories. Utah Lake white bass, there are no consumption advisories. And this kind of alludes to what you're talking about. You know, white bass are omnivores, they'll eat absolutely everything. But they're fairly fast growing and fairly short lived, so those species don't tend to accumulate, you know, heavy metals or PCBs like some of these other ones. And also the fact that for the most part, they're getting a fair bit of their food out of the water column. They're eating zooplanktons, bugs, other fish, whereas some of the ones that do have the consumption advisories are those benthic species like common carp, bullheads, channel cats.
Yeah, you know, they eat off the bottom.
I will not suggest anybody make health decisions without being informed, but I just always encourage people to be informed, you know, read the information, don't be scared, don't be afraid, but just make themselves educated. I personally, I think it's probably safe to say I'm not going to die of PCBs, but you know, if you've got youngsters or something like that, you should definitely take it.
We had a biologist in here one year that we had that same concern. He said their test proved that the water in Utah Lake is as clean as Deer Creek.
Yeah, that's pretty.
It's just the sediment and the mixture of the water.
That's pretty accurate. When we take the water samples, we do not find the PCBs. And when you take a surprising number of sediment samples, you also do not find it. They're getting it from somewhere. It's bioaccumulating, probably from within those. But yeah, the water relative to PCBs and mercury is totally accurate.
Yeah, the same biologist, I think, pointed out that when they test these fish, they take the entire fish and grind it up, puree it up. So, innards and everything. So, heavy metals tend to concentrate in the liver. So the big cats that are many years old are going to get that accumulation of the heavy metals in their liver. It's not necessarily in the meat. So that's another, you know, testing can make the fish look heavier in contaminants than the actual fillets would be.
So I got to stop eating the livers?
Yeah.
If you're big on the catfish, I'm sorry.
Eating those catfish stomachs.
Okay.
Start glowing, we'll know.
So yeah, they've actually changed some of their sampling now, but they will typically list, the offal, the stomachs, and the tissues. So again, we can share that link with everybody. Just encourage everybody to be educated about it.
That would be a more accurate sample. Thanks.
Yeah. The other thing you might do is, if you really want to get into the weeds on this one, there's two different regulatory authorities for fish. There's one for, say, farm-raised fish, and there's another for fish that come out of Utah Lake wild caught fish. And it's a little bit interesting because if you really start getting into it, look at some of the actual values, whether it's mercury or PCB for the fish that you're pulling out of Utah Lake and those advisories, and then look up the FDA's regulations on fish that are farmed. And there's two different regulations. So, I mean, you can have one that's flagged as high from Utah Lake that you could be buying at the grocery store that's not flagged at all, if that makes sense. So again, just everybody educate themselves, Google Utah fish advisories, and you should get that page right away.
What's the outline of the drop down from?
Oh, so on this graph?
Yeah.
So this is a little different data. So some of the ways that us as fisheries biologists look at size classes is you look at what's called stock size, quality, preferred, memorable trophy. That just helps us kind of capture, how these fish compare to other waters. And so really what it is telling you here is this top one is most of these fish are what we call quality white bass. And that just reflects the fact that white bass size is different than, say, striped bass. Like, if you catch a 12-inch striped bass, that's a small one. If you catch a 12-inch white bass, that's still quality fish. So that's another way that we can help look at populations. What's causing this one here? I don't know. But if you look at some of the relative weights that correspond with it, you've just got a couple of years there where we've got some pretty skinny fish. That's maybe something we can talk about on one of our other slides. We do occasionally have some white bass die-offs. Kind of get this perfect storm. So they'll come through the winter. They've had not a lot to eat. They've had pretty empty stomachs. They have some turnover of the lake. They go right into a stressful spawn. You just get all these cumulative stressors that can hit them at the same time and actually cause some white bass die-offs. We had one, was it last year? It was last year. Yeah, it was a pretty big one last year. We're always... I don't really think it had much of a significant impact on the population, to be honest with you. I don't really have the answer to that one, quite frankly. We spent some time walking the shorelines and tried to extrapolate how many we thought, and I forget our numbers, but we didn't even think it was like 10% of the population. Now, some of you anglers that didn't do any good on under the ice fishing, like I didn't do very good this year. That wouldn't say they all died off, right? But anyway, there's a few things going on there, but really a lot of this is driven from the fact that you have a lot of white bass. So it's kind of like, a hatchery situation or your farmyard. You got all these fish together, have a little change, and it can stress them out pretty quick. Good news is they reproduce quickly, they grow. So life history. So I just really wanted to focus on this a little bit. I know you guys might not be, nerding out over migrations for spawning as much as I am as a fisheries biologist, but as anglers, I'm just kind of understanding this will help you, because a lot of times we're targeting these fish for some of the best fishing can be during the spawn. So I'll have some pictures on this that I really feel like help my fish brain think it through, but I'll just throw out some dates to you guys. So typically on the spawning congregations, you have that start first with the males. So that's why a lot of times you guys will catch just male white bass after male white bass. They're trying to get there first. And they're essentially just waiting with bated breath, waiting for the females to show up. Typically about the time that the earliest that they will really start to concentrate is mid-April. So I heard some talk about going fishing. I often have like mid-May or 1st of May as kind of like, hey Chris, don't forget to go white bass fishing, like if you haven't been paying attention to it. I'm in no way saying you can't catch them earlier than that. You can go any time of the year and catch them. But really that kind of late-ish April, mid-April is probably when you really need to start thinking about going out. And we'll talk about some ways to follow the spawn. So like if you got a group of kids, you can check some of the reports, figure out if things are happening, where it's happening before you go out. They're very active actually spawning in May. So they're gathering up, right? They're getting ready for the spawn. And typically that's when the water temp hits about 62. And so all of this is controlled by a couple of factors. Water temp, but also runoff. So occasionally you get a year where it's like they're early, they're late, it doesn't quite make sense. We'll just blame that on temperatures or some of the flows on Provo. So this is kind of my little beautiful diagram to help remind me some of what's happening. This is Utah Lake State Park. I will throw out a caveat, we'll talk about this in a minute. Things may be changing with the new delta down at Utah Lake, just above the state park. But really everything I'm going to talk about here, you could apply to American Fork River Inlet. You could apply to Beer Creek or Spring Creek Inlet. You could even apply this to Bird Island, because they do the same thing roughly at Bird Island. What it amounts to is we've got pre-spawn fish, and then the fish that when they start moving into those spawning grounds. So obviously my little nice blue things represent concentrations of fish, hopefully. So typically March or April, if you've had ice on, they may still be concentrated in the harbors, but as soon as that ice comes off, those fish start to distribute, just kind of spread out a little bit, right? So this March-April window, you can catch plenty of fish, but they typically are spread out a little more. So I like easy fishing, I like big concentrations, right? When you start moving into April and May, you have them start congregating, or what we call staging, around these spawning areas. So this is Provo River coming in. This could be Battle Creek. This could be Spring Creek. This could be the rocky areas out at the Knolls or the Bird Island. So again, really just very similar idea. When you start going into, you mentioned kind of that 1st of May, June, you'll typically still have fish congregating out, but you'll also have them move further upstream on those tributaries. And this is kind of where we talked about catching them is not very difficult, but finding them can be. So if you've got any experience on Provo River, if you're out here fishing, where they were like 4 days ago, you might do great. They also might have all now moved a quarter-mile upstream in the Provo River. And so that's why we really suggest, like when you're going out fishing, ask somebody, check out the Facebook page. It's pretty easy when somebody's got 75 fish there. You see the background and it's like, that's the lake, that's muddy. You know what I mean? You see the color difference. Look at their page and be like, oh, that's nice and clear and it's in the shade. It's like, that's got to be further up the tributaries. Because if you sit here where they were a few days ago, you might fish all day and catch like a handful of fish. You might literally move 50 feet, 500 feet, and there's a school of them that you're just going to be able to hopefully catch fish after fish. So that's where I get stubborn sometimes, is I'm like, oh man, I tore it up at that spot at this time of year. That's where I'm going to go. I drive past 15 or 20 other guys shoulder to shoulder, and I'm like, oh no, they don't know what they're doing. You do kind of have to think through it and be ready to move around. This is a little table that Packer and I put together a few years ago. It's kind of useful, especially if you guys have some friends that have maybe done this before. Again, this is not rocket science, right? You guys catch these fish, you know your tricks, but it's just a little summary table that we've spread around to help out people. It is one of those links. If not, I can send it. And it really just kind of goes through some of this that we've talked about. Locations, where they're at, best time to fish. You see that, May is kind of what I call a fast fishing. Pretty useful summary information. But, I didn't give away any of my secrets here. It's all pretty much common knowledge. So here's kind of a caveat. I may not talk too much to you guys about this unless you want to talk about it. But things are probably going to be different this year and different next year. I think it's going to be an overall positive. Just flip to this. Is everybody familiar with the Provo River Delta project that's going on at Utah Lake?
Yeah, we had someone come speak on the Provo River Delta last year.
So I'll just give the very quick summary and then I'll flag, you guys can flag your questions. So here's the existing Utah Lake State Park. You recognize the north and south jetties, right? This is the regular, what they call the old Provo River channel. You can definitely see that it's not necessarily a natural channel, right? It's had some channelization some redirecting around farm ground, that sort of thing. So it's not exactly a natural old channel. And what they've tried to do is restore basically a natural delta. So one of the big problems, both from June sucker recovery, but also from other species, is that we get so much lake interface here at the river that anything that goes up to spawn, it basically kind of just hits this really slow. It's not serving as a conveyor belt. It's almost just like larval fish get swept down there, and then what's waiting for them? Northern pike, largemouth bass, white bass, channel cats, and so really you get poor survivorship of anything that, most part, anything that swims up the river to spawn. So this is kind of like a mini Hobble Creek. If you have seen the work they've done at Hobble Creek, created that delta. Now you've got multiple channels, and it just fans them out and shoots them into vegetation, into lots of little ponds. And so that's really what they're trying to do with June sucker. The kicker is it should also benefit other species, right? Not to mention, all of a sudden when you've got 4 channels, and each one of those is like the equivalent of American Fork Creek or like Spring Creek, some of these like tiny little trivs that you can sit and catch white bass all day on. I really think the fishing and the spawning of these fish is going to be better once they start using that. The trick is, though, right now they're doing some work on the old channel. They're going to have a little barrier put in here, so the white bass may be confused this year. Also, we can't get into the delta yet at fish, so that's going to be asking you guys to be patient this year. And
how far
we'll
is that?
have some good ones next year. What's that?
How far up the river is that?
And when would the barrier start?
So
Is that past
eventually,
the pipe? I'm assuming it's past the pipe.
yeah. We can try to answer that. So I may be pointing at the wrong spot, but there's going to be a little bit of a barrier. Do you guys know where the bridge is, basically by the state park? So there, I say it's a barrier. What it's going to be is a dam. So it's actually going to raise the old channel, old Provo River channel, up a couple of feet. So then there'll be water still coming out, but there'll be like a elevation barrier where probably not many fish can jump up it. And that should probably happen probably about April 1, somewhere around in there. Now that means that this year there's still going to be water flowing. There's always going to be water flowing. That's part of the plan, is 10 CFS of in-stream flow. So I think you're still going to have plenty of white bass stacked up below it to fish. But I'm also anticipating, what is that, Mike? Like a quarter mile upstream, or excuse me, a quarter mile up lake, you have the new delta. So these fish are pretty quick at keying in on new places to spawn. So that's why I say I think this year the fish are going to be a little confused, and the anglers may be too. In the future, I feel like we're probably going to see really good runs of white bass in the delta. In 24, they're going to open that up to the public, so that's kind of why I asked for patience. This year, we're all going to be like trying to figure out where to go. It is if you think it's worth waiting for. We were there the other day, and there's still a lot of heavy equipment running, so it's probably good that they don't have access in there right now. They're not twiddling their thumbs. They're still doing some work on the road and everything. So,
Do you think that'll affect the walleye spawn as much?
I think it'll have similar effects on the walleye. The question is, and I don't fully know the answer to this. I mean, full disclosure, I work with June suckers. I love June suckers. I think they're valuable. Full disclosure, I like to catch white bass and walleye and channel cats. So I feel like I'm probably about as even keeled a response as you're going to get. I think the delta is going to be a great fishery. I think we just need to be patient while they're getting it going.
Are there pathways to it? Easier fish?
Yes, it should be. So there is a trail plan in place for it. Now, are you going to necessarily drive up and cast your line 5 feet from your car like you can at Utah Lake State Park? No, but there is going to be a trail system. They're working on a recreational plan. I'm on that group. There's other anglers on that group. So I mean, I think it's going to be impressive once we get it finished. And I think it's going to be a great resource for fishing. It is going to be a little different. And you know, we all hate change, right? So, sorry, I'm long-winded on this one. Just another thing, we talked about raising the Old River Channel. That's going to be converted over to a community fishery. So it'll still be there. You'll still have 10 CFS. There'll still be fishing options. We'll probably start stocking it in, it depends on when the recreational plan gets finished, but we'll probably start stocking that in 2024.
What's by definition a community fishery versus a
Yeah,
flood?
good question. So we haven't set the regs yet for the Provo River community fishery, but typically it's a fishery that we are stocking high rates of fish. So we're trying to keep our catch rates really high. But typically it only has a possession limit of 2 fish. So, you know, if you want to catch a ton of white bass and keep all of those, you'll be downstream and you'll be in the delta and you'll be everywhere else. If you want to catch, you know, some stocked wipers, some stocked rainbows in the community fishery, then you'll still be 2 fish.
In community fisheries, do they usually have like more access and things like that? It's like wheelchair access and things like that that usually make additional. Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, typically the county is going to eventually take over this property, the old Delta, or excuse me, scratch that, not the old Delta, the old River Channel. They've got some rough design plans for recreational amenities right now. They include cantilevered fishing piers in the old channel, improved trail access, wheelchair available access, things like that. So it definitely will be a little different feel, but I don't think it's going to be a negative feel. I think we're still going to have
flow
some good
goes through the
options.
delta and then back to the old channel, or how's the water going to support the existing?
Great question. So here's the diversion. What's that road, Packer?
It's there, that park.
Yeah, what is that? I always get Boat Harbor. It's not Boat Harbor, it's Lakeshore.
Lakeshore.
Okay, so we've got Lakeshore Drive here. There's the high school there, if that makes sense. Here's, Main Street or exit 265 off of I-15. It's down here. So the diversion for the water is basically just a little bit of downstream. And what they have, they're still working on it a little bit, but it's 3 pipes, basically, 3 diversion pipes that bring 10 CFS from the upstream river channel. They deposit it into the old Provo River channel. So there's
10 CFS?
Yeah.
That's not much, is it?
Well, considering that it can get down to 15 or 20 in typical years, yeah, it's still pretty significant, I guess. So, and most of that water that kept water in that reach historically was all June Sucker purchased water. So I can't necessarily complain of them shifting their water over to the Delta and still giving 10 CFS from the old channel. Sorry, that's more Delta talk than I wanted, but I was happy to answer those. Well, that I was anticipating, but I wanted to answer those questions. So, if you got any other questions about the Delta, I forget what their website is, but if you just Google like Provo River Delta and look for the Mitigation Commission's website, it's got good maps, it's got timeline, it has frequently asked questions, that sort of thing.
Yeah, one of the project managers we had, there's a YouTube video on our YouTube page from the project manager, Provo River Delta. One of them.
Was that Melissa or Mike Mills? Or?
I think his name was Mike.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was. I'll have to check.
The Mitigation Commission is actually, I feel like they do a pretty good job of trying to make everyone happy, which means they don't make anyone totally happy. But I feel like they got it with this one. So, other white bass hotspots. So these are not exactly hotspots. I'm not, going to send you guys and no one's going to be there. These are pretty well known. You guys forgive me, my map doesn't exactly correspond with everything because I just kind of did some maps for geographic locations, because if I showed you the entire lake, none of it would make sense. I will point out we've got some links to these that both the Utah Lake Commission and the Division of Wildlife Resources have 2 different access websites basically strictly for Utah Lake access. And so those links will be at the end. And again, if you just Google any of these, you'll find them. So we talked about, in general, just anything where there's running water. So this can be Provo River, Spanish Fork River, American Fork Creek when it's got water coming in. Sometimes it doesn't always. Battle Creek, Benjamin Slough, the treatment plant outflow, and those might be a few that you guys aren't familiar with. So Powell Slough, I'll just go here. We got Utah Lake State Park, Provo River. Here's the new delta. You've got Powell Slough up above. Mike fishes Powell Slough quite a bit, don't you, Mike?
I do. Yeah, it's a sweet little spot. It takes a little bit of foot soldier work to get into, but there's a lot of cool braiding. Some nice pockets where if you're not hitting white bass, you're usually picking up largemouth. Some nice bluegill and black crappie, so kind of a nice mixture of fish that stack up in there. So it's a sweet little braided network of water.
And I'm sure if you guys haven't already, just figure out how to use Google Maps. You can find these spots. You can see on the aerial photos where you'll see cleaner water coming into the lake. Anywhere you see that pattern, that's going to be a great spot to target for white bass during the spawn, walleye during the spawn, northern pike during the spawn. Just in general, some of the other spots, we've already hit on a few of these. Really of the harder jetties, especially if you're kind of keying in on that when they're staging right before the spawn. We didn't talk that much about it, but white bass will also spawn anywhere you've got pretty decent rock piles. So if you fish Utah Lake, you probably know there's just a lot of silt bottoms, right? So anywhere you can find rock, whether that's at the knolls, whether that's some of these jetties, whether that's Bird Island, right? You can typically find spawning white bass. The other locations, I already kind of hit on these. The knolls, Provo River, Jordan River. I was going to see if anybody here fishes the Jordan River. There's spots on the Jordan River that you can nail white bass. Next to Inlet Park is a great spot. Next to the inlets, like the, what do you call that, Confluence Park, Mike? Anywhere where you've got another tributary coming into the Jordan River can be a great spot for white bass. So this is one I haven't really explored that much. I do a lot of fishing on the Jordan, but I'm usually targeting catfish. I don't know if anybody's got any white bass honey holes on the Jordan that they want to send me exact UTM locations on. So that was a very quick overview. Again, I kind of feel like I'm telling you guys something you already know. I'll probably go through this even more quickly. Baits, I like to keep it simple, right? So I'm not going to show you anything you probably haven't seen before, and that's the beauty of white bass. Whether you're you or me or a little kid, you don't have to have a lot of gear to go out and target these. Some of my favorites, and worth a slide in itself, is curly-tail jigs. What can you not catch on a curly-tail jig? I call it June suckers, common carp on curly-tail jig. Really, you'll see a common theme here. You're really just going for that profile, typically of something that's imitating a minnow or a bait fish in that 1.5 to 3 inch range, right? That can be anything from 1/32 of an ounce to 1/4 of an ounce, just kind of depending on what habitat you're at. White, pink, chartreuse, sparkle, you name it. It's probably just because my 5-year-old likes pink, but that white and pink one is one of my favorites. Some people swear by chartreuse, you name it. So I will mention this, and again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but these fish can see quite a few baits, and also when they are spawning, sometimes they're really aggressive and want to hit. Other times they take a little more coaxing. So when you're fishing for these, kind of think like you're walleye fishing or you're drop shotting or something like that. Give it some action, right? Don't just throw it out and reel it. Some days you'll catch a slew, other days you probably just had 50 fish that ran right through the middle of it, just ignored it. So, very similar idea. Tube jigs, hair boo jigs, right? Very similar idea. Very similar colors. Sometimes with these little crappie jigs, if they're being finicky, they'll hit something a little bit smaller. I've even used like little ice jigs, you know. Those crappie jigs, those are just like an 1.5-inch ones. Set them up as tandem. Sometimes it helps so you can throw them a little bit further. You can also try the different colors. One thing we didn't talk about that much with the curly tails, but if things are being finicky, tip it with something, right? When in doubt, put a night crawler, a little chunk of night crawler on it, a little chunk of white bass. You can use white bass from Utah Lake as cut bait in Utah Lake. Gulp maggots, shrimp, little pieces of shrimp. What else, Mike? What am I forgetting?
The accent spray looks great too.
What's that?
Just put the accent spray.
Yeah. Yeah, some of the goop sprays or whatever. So.
Corn even from time to time,
Thank
like
you.
a
Yeah.
piece of shoe peg corn, soak it in some garlic type deal, works pretty good.
Inline spinners, again, these are pretty common lures. You know, some of my favorites are those bumblebee colored rooster tails, you name it, right? Again, just something with some flash, try some different colors.
Just,
Gold and silver, blue fox silver too looks amazing.
There you go.
when he first took me out of the spawn, we came back to like 80 fish. At first, he had the silver fox on the upper left, all silver. I had one that was identical, same size, number 2, and mine had a tiny little zigzag blue streak on it. Otherwise, identical spinner. I caught absolutely nothing. He caught cast after cast. So I said, give me one of those. So as soon as I put the one which one was
It was
with?
either silver or gold.
Anyway, it matched his, and I was catching them the same. It was such a minute, you could hardly even tell it was there.
Little
It was
difference.
crazy.
Yeah, we filled a 25-foot string during 3 hours. It was fun.
It was a lot of fun. But is that, do you see that much sensitivity and bait distinction?
When they're picky, I do. I definitely see a lot of different techniques that seem like it makes a difference. I haven't noticed so much color, but I've been, you know, standing right next to guys that catch fish after fish, and I watch their rod tip. I'm like, okay, they're doing something different, you know. And I watch that a lot. The other thing I've noticed is more the downsizing, like if they're being finicky to maybe downsize, and you know, try not to throw a heavy jig because you know you guys all fish. You know that slow flutter will often elicit a strike. So, but I wouldn't doubt it on the color. I really wouldn't. I just haven't personally noticed as much. I'm glad that you were able to catch someone who switched, because otherwise I would have thought you just weren't living life right or something.
That's what I was wondering.
What's funny, like sometimes you'll be like catching them or you're trying to find them, and right before your line will hit the water right by your feet, and you'll get one.
Yeah.
That's like to the right of your feet. And you're casting 20 feet out or 30 feet away.
That is an excellent point. So you kind of jogged my memory on 2 things there. I've had days when literally you'll be standing on the rock jetties at the state park and you just do like this with your jig or something like that. They are at your feet. So don't miss out on that. And then the other thing is, you know, I kind of have my finder lures, if you will, when I'm looking for them. And often that's like a heavier curly tail jig, or I'm a Jake's fan fanatic. I got so many of those things. They're just like in my glove box. They're like sitting around in cup holders. Those are great ones at any time, but they're really great if you're kind of finding them and you just notice where you got it, and then you might switch over to kind of a little more, you know, finesse presentation or something. So, Becker fishes a lot with streamers on his fly rod. Mike, you got any thoughts on that?
No, just kind of echoing that same thing of with screamers, I kind of treat it the same way as I would a crankbait or a spoon. Usually I'm going to start out chucking something like a something heavier, a bigger screamer type deal to try and act as my seeker. A lot of times it's just a clouser. that I'm throwing, and most of those times I'm fan casting, so I'm just going to be treating it like I'm targeting just a largemouth and fan casting from side to side until I notice where I get my hits, and then I will usually either I'll keep testing with my clouser to that spot, but if they start to turn off, then I'm downsizing. So I'll usually go from a clouser to like a crystal bugger, and kind of work it slow, and then make sure that I'm pausing as I'm getting closer to structure, because it's one of those where I'm usually to the point where I'm about backing my fly rod off near the edge is when I'll get hit. So it's one of those where it tests my patience as it gets closer to you, of like you have that urge, that need to like bring back out and recast, but it just takes that little bit more of a moment of that pause for them to just come by and basically act as a sweeper crew and pick up what you're doing right there. So
Why haven't they established, going back to the original site, I'm just curious, why haven't they established a catch limit there? So why that, is there too many of them?
Yeah,
Is the publisher continuing to grow, or?
That's a good question. So why do we have no limits, basically, right? So if you go back to some of that data I showed you where we've got really high densities, we can have poor relative weights, so they show up a little skinny. What it amounts to is there's typically a few too many of them. So they've got density-dependent drivers. So I mean, it's just a fancy way of saying, hey, there's too many mouths to feed.
Sure.
So that's why we do not have regulations, or excuse me, why we do not have limits on those. And we've been doing that for forever. And in reality, I don't want to tell people to go catch fish if they're not going to use them. But the past few years, I don't think angling has hurt the population at all. Because when you see all those get harvested, but we've still got fast growth yet skinny fish, I mean, it's still a good idea to harvest them. Kind of like a similar scenario to be, they're doing a lot better now, but some of the populations of brown trout on the Provo River, we had a lot of little ones, so there's a lot of mouths to feed. That's just kind of where we're at right now with white bass. And it's probably going to be how it is always. Because if you look at other areas, they get a little bigger, but it's not typically a population where you like raise trophy white bass. There's just going to be a lot of those 1 to 2-year-old fish.
So that's something that I think has been hard for old schoolers and new schoolers. Is that balance of should we harvest fish to help or should we not harvest fish to help? And so it sounds like you kind of want us to keep the white bass. Is that a true statement? I don't know. Like,
I would say it may be a little different, Badger, that if you're going to eat them and put them to good use, take what you want. I mean, keep it. Don't have them going to waste in the back of your truck. Don't just keep them to, feed your dogs, things like that. But yeah, ethical harvest on these guys, you're not going to hurt them. I feel like fisheries biologists have kind of almost done like too good of a job. Like for so long, we were always preaching catch and release.
yeah.
And partly that's our fault for maybe over preaching it in other areas, but also, it's kind of our marketing problem where it's like we want it in some areas. We look at the slot limits for growing those big cutthroats up at the strawberry, and it's like that's important. But we haven't also done as good a job educating about some of these other waters that could actually use a little harvest. And when you guys are like coming back and we're like, well, the division changed their mind. Sometimes we do get it wrong, but also conditions change. You know what I mean? So it's like I like to feel like most of the time, I always tell anglers, I want them to be mad at me for the right reasons. You know what I mean? But to understand kind of why we're doing this and not be stuck on these preconceived notions and stuff. But yeah, right now you're not going to hurt it. It's white bass.
Do you guys feel like Utah Lake is underutilized as a fishery
I definitely do.
because of the stigma of it being included?
Yeah, so we've been fighting it for years. I mean, there are some real issues with Utah Lake. But you look at it's 97,000 acres. And really, I mean, unless you spend all your time like right next to the state park or like, Linden at noon on a Saturday, really there's a ton of area out there that's fishable, that you can recreate on. Absolutely, I feel like it's underutilized.
But you guys don't stock, do you? But yeah, it's a good fish.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, we haven't stocked it for maybe 50 years, something like that. So everything we've got in here is natural reproduction. So one other one, and I'll just kind of throw this out there. You know, we're talking about taking kids out. I'm a bait fisherman. I always say taking kids out, but I bait fish all the time, especially for catfish. But for white bass, it's still a really good method. For kids, a lot of times, just a little small hook with a little bit, not too much, like a half-inch night crawler or something like that on a tiny little piece of shrimp, corn. I'll do the same thing on a crappie tube jig. Hook some corn, hook some night crawler, and then put it under a slip bobber. I mean, this is just easy stuff for kids, right? Sometimes I'll just drag one behind me in the boat like this so I can be catfishing and catch catfish bait, i.e. white bass, all at the same time. So just some other ideas for you guys. White bass meat, we mentioned that one. They have no shame. They will eat the little tasty morsel of white bass meat just fine. So
What was the flick presentation? The previous slide, keep going back.
Oh, here. It's back. It's the button underneath.
I think I got out of the survey.
Oh, it's back here.
Yeah.
See on the spot on the right, the first bullet point at the end, it said flick presentation.
So,
Also.
yeah, a flig presentation. So a flig is a floating jig. I don't know if you guys seen this. You know Pat Scout, tube dude. You know he's a big flig guy. So it basically just looks like a like a jig head, right? Except instead of lead, it has some sort of a high plastic buoyant, right? Yeah. So one of the good ways to fish for white bass or catfish, for that matter, you can get as fancy as you want, but you've got your flig, your floating jig, maybe it's got a piece of cut bait, maybe it's got a worm on it, and then just something as simple as some split shot. And so basically you're just presenting that bait, where it's a foot off the bottom, 6 inches off the bottom, you name it. So that's a really good way to catch catfish. It's also a good way to catch white bass. The only negative on that is you're kind of just throwing it out there and waiting. So it's like if you're actively trying to find fish, then I'm usually casting something. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this. I can just share this with you guys. We've got 2 different access websites that can show you everywhere you want to go on the lake, right? We've got fishing reports, the guidebook. I did just want to maybe mention these 2 or harp on this a little bit more. When it comes to anything, especially white bass, get on Facebook, get on the FishBrain app. If you want to save yourself some time, just look and see where people have catched them, right? Because it's those days that you catch 100 fish that you're going to remember. For bringing kids down, I don't ask for people's walleye spots or people's largemouth bass spots, but I feel like white bass, there's a lot in there. The more the merrier. You know what I mean? Let's get some kids on them. Let's get us on them. Let's catch a whole bunch. Do a fish fry. They're not going to get much bigger. Let's catch them while we can. And the other thing is, Pat Scout has got a really good, what we call white paper, like a paper he put together. It's got a lot of these access points. It goes way in depth into techniques. And if you like what you read there, Pat Scouten also has a ton of these documents on catfishing on Utah Lake. I mean, he's got every access point, every area. He's got maps of it. Here's where the hot springs come up. You name it. So that's another good resource for white bass or for catfish.
Well, probably you're going to answer that. So the place that they call the Abyss in Utah Lake, what I'm talking about? So there's a spot in Utah Lake, towards kind of the dam, kind of by Surgeon Springs, out below the lake, and it's a big hole. There's a couple of them, kind of close together, about 14 feet deep.
Yeah. So
for Utah Lake, that's deep. My question is, do you guys know if there's fish that's stacked in there?
I don't know. So I've heard, I will show some of my ignorance here. I have heard of this mythical 14-foot place on Utah Lake. I've never found it.
That's where Nessie sits, man.
It's the Lake Ness monster. I don't know if I'm sure the catfish would love it, right? anywhere there's deeper water, topography change. I don't know if the white bass would stack in there or not, to be honest with you.
Never got anything out of it, but it's hard to stay on it sometimes.
You were saying the hot spring? That there's hot springs and feed into the lake?
Yeah, there's,
White bass congregate?
yes. Yeah, so there's a couple of different locations. Saratoga Springs is obviously named for some of the springs that come up, and I call them hot springs. I mean, they're warm springs typically, but like this time of year, they're hot springs, right? Compared to the 41 degree water temperature. Lincoln Beach area has a lot around the corner on what I call the L-shaped boat harbor, the old L-shaped harbor. You can see it on the map; you'll recognize it. There's springs that come up there. Where else, Mike?
Those are kind of the main two. That one around Lincoln is definitely, it's right between the marina and Lincoln Point, they call it, kind of like right in between those two. And there's just a couple little coves, if you will, that they definitely draw in, especially early season. Those fish start to key in on that warmer water, like chemical cue or thermal cue, and they'll come in and start stacking in there pretty early. So
Good spot for walleye too. Anywhere, you guys know the drill. Anywhere we've got a cold lake with warmer water coming in, that's usually attractant. And if you've got a warm lake with cold water, did I get that right? Yeah. Or the reverse is true too. So basically, depending on what sort of water they're looking for at the time of year, this time of year they're usually trying to look for something a little bit warmer.
You mentioned an app a minute ago. We were talking Facebook and some app.
Oh yeah,
Fishbrain?
So Fishbrain. Just curious, who uses Fishbrain? Does anybody else use Fishbrain?
Sometimes.
It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool app. Full disclosure, I use it mostly for. It seems to be pretty popular with younger people. So like, I get all kinds of reports from the community fisheries on that. There's often. It's pretty good for ice fishing. It is a little bit like, I'm not sure what the right word for it is. I mean, it's kind of a trophy board or a bragging board.
Yeah.
So you know what I mean. So you gotta kind of take it with a grain of salt. But it's a good one, that I use quite a bit for seeing like when people are starting to catch fish. And the other one that I use is Facebook. There's quite a few groups on there. There's Utah Lake Anglers Forum, that's kind of everybody. There's Utah Lake Fishermen. Those are maybe the two big ones, Mike, is that right?
yeah, you've got a smattering of others where it's like Utah Shore Fishermen is one that I'll keep an eye on, especially if I'm starting to, or if I'm wanting to know when people are starting to pick up white bass and channel cats from shore. Utah Fishing Fanatics is another one, or Utah Anglers Report, kind of like that variety gives you a decent smattering of again, a lot of bragging posts, but from those you can kind of tease where they're catching, or at least start to see where fish are starting to come in. So it's one of those where you definitely have the younger generation, which good on them for going out and wanting to get trophies, but a lot of them being like, oh my gosh, my catch, and I'm more interested in like, okay, you're in this area, cool, they're starting to move in here, rather than the grip and grins type deal. But fun to see where they start popping up and when.
And for even a fisherman, I'm not much for social media, but I'm all for like, having a little help. Even for fishermen that know what they're doing, I spend a lot of time looking at techniques on YouTube. I mentioned this. I watch them with my boy. You know what I mean? Facebook and everything like that. Like if you're kind of figuring, like when's the white bass spawn happening? Has it happened yet? If you look on that page and there's like no white bass, that gives you a pretty good idea. I mean, so you can use it judiciously without it running your life. Now Packer gets on there, and every green sunfish he catches that's 2 inches long, he's got his G.I. Joe figure on it, and that's fun too, especially if you're kids. It's like I got a 5-year-old, and it's like, if I get him into fishing and excited by him posting something or watching a YouTube video, I'm okay with that. So all right, I feel like that was long-winded. You guys got any other questions?
It was really great.
Any suggestions, like baits? I don't know what my time is, but any baits that you guys use or spots or techniques you recommend?
One thing I learned from people is I do pretty well fishing with the spinners, but some people will put the little chartreuse jigs and will double them up. because one here, and cast it out. Especially if there's deep pockets letting stuff down. You'll catch two at a time all day long, and they're in the spawn.
That's a lot of fun. I've done that before. It's a great finder rig, and I've seen people put 3 of them on there, right? So it's a little tedious sometimes when they're casting, but it's not that big a deal to get it untangled.
If you-
really help you find fish.
So when they start coming into the river, me and him will so we'll wade up and down the river as far as we can go. So right at Utah Lake when the river comes in, there's that brush pile area. From right there all the way down the river, we'll just walk back and forth until we find them. Usually,
What they find us,
Yeah.
sometimes will be the same spot. There'll be nothing, then you come back 20 minutes later.
one thing I've learned though, don't leave fish to find fish,
Exactly.
especially with white bass.
Yeah. So, I think we kind of alluded to this, but I mean, when they're congregating, it's when they're stacked up, it's not just like one here and one here and one here. It's like they're all here, and then 10 feet over, there's none. So, I mean, it can be a great experience if you find them, but then you also kind of realize that you might have to move, right? And you can usually see them when they're in the river. Don't give up just sight fishing for them. You can usually see them. Anything else you guys want to add or any questions?
Any tricks with the sonar? Because it's pretty shallow, right? So sonar seeking is kind of hard. You have side view and you have down view. Obviously, it's not going to help you unless you're right on top of them because it's so shallow. Is there got any tips with that?
I'm not a sonar expert. The only time I've really seen it effective is if you had live scope or you're side scanning. Yeah, like when they're staging, like and you're looking for them around the mouths of harbors and jetties. Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you should be able to see some concentrations. These guys are only 11 inches, but they're typically going to be 15 or 20 of them together. You should be able to fairly easily distinguish between them and common carp or channel cats or something like that. So yeah, I throw that to the group. I'm usually about 10 years behind on my sonar and everything. So if anybody's got any better thoughts on that.
This crew is pretty. We don't do a lot of Utah Lake fishing. I think that's why we're targeting it this time because we haven't done a lot with this group. A lot of us haven't even fished Utah Lake. I've never fished Utah Lake, so I think that's why we're trying to get into it a little bit more because it's a lot more sustainable fishery than some of the other places we've been fishing as a club. So it's good.
No, I'll kind of keep you guys in the loop. If you guys get out and you start seeing them, keep me in the loop. I've spent enough time, but one of my favorite things on Utah Lake is catfish.
Oh, yeah.
So keep some of these guys for bait. You can use them as cut bait, really good bait for catfish. The catfishing is usually May, again, kind of May, June, or some of May.
Now, but yeah, May is the best time.
And again, you can catch them anytime, but you want to tear it up probably about the same time that you're looking for white bass, would also be in a great time to be fishing for channel cats. And legitimately, our average size of channel cats on Utah Lake is 5 to 7 pounds, like for reals. That's not just like me saying that. So it's like if you catch one, if you caught anything less than that, consider yourself lucky because that's a rarity. Most of them are that 5, 7, 8 pounds.
What I usually do is I'm fishing for white bass on a boat. I'll cast one line out for catfish and use the smaller white bass that I've caught as bait and just keep fishing for white bass.
They're great, fresh. They're great. Throw them in your freezer and use them the next year. Half of my freezer is probably white bass nuggets, but it's a good bait too. So
Yeah, I noticed something. I was in Wisconsin at the White Bass Run, Fremont, Wisconsin last year, and there were so many fish being caught. I said, wait a minute, it's too easy. So I put some corn on the hooks, and everybody kind of snickered and made faces at me, and I put on the white bass in with corn. So if you run out of real bait or whatever, you can put some corn on it. And they just hit it just as hard as they did. Yeah, anything.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.